origins of World War One, or as it was called before World War II, the Great War. Three items converged together, and these three items would create World War One. A war that was easy to get into, and a war that was not easily finished. These three factor items are personality, military, and geography. Franz Ferdinand sought to marry a woman of non-royal stature who went against the advice of his secret services and the advice of his wife. The Serbian nationalists, as we have discussed in the first lecture, under the Black Hand, had determined to assassinate Franz and his wife, which were the heirs to the succession of Austria, and Austria had declared war on Serbia, an ally of special arrangement with the Russians. Wilhelm II, at the time Kaiser of Germany, was able to do an immense amount of damage during his short time on Earth. He was extremely paranoid, outspoken, and militaristic at a very dangerous time when Germany was taking off in an industrial way. He was able to bring the British and French together, which had been colonial rivals over the past century, with his interventions in Morocco. The Kaiser even wanted to develop and build a Baghdad to Berlin railway, which is not bad in and of itself. But both the personalities of Franz Ferdinand and Wilhelm II represented a peaceful, old, aristocratic, conservative order. After World War I, this order was demolished and was replaced by totalitarian states, for example, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, which were representatives of fascism and communism. Military and technology were an item factor as well. Technology, by the eve of World War I, in the summer of 1914, was such that armies could engage in horrific battle but would not be able to end the game or close the deal. And so secret plans created by general staffs, unbeknownst to many leaders' personalities, such as those mentioned afore, Franz and Wilhelm, had generated the ability to mobilize millions of men within 24-hour periods of time, armed with latest weapons, technology, transport, and machines of destruction. Never before had contenders seen such ferocious firepower. Although the trains could transport, they could not navigate the dirt roads that would lead the men to the battlefield. And of course, if you study American history, you'll know that artillery was first used during the American Civil War. Now it is even more so because of industrialization. The plan had its pivot on the border of Germany and France, and it proposed a sweep through Belgium. Could not be accomplished since it would take days for troops to navigate the roads to surprise the enemy. Enter geography. On an atlas or a map of Europe, just to the north of Germany is called the Great European Plain, cutting through Belgium and the Low Country to France. The French had a similar plan that went the opposite way than that of the Germans. There was a need for the Germans to cut through Belgium. When Belgium was violated by the German army, the British were pulled into the war via treaties that were made during the period of the Napoleonic Wars of the previous century. Thus, the Romans were mobilizing on French-built railroads to the east of Germany. In secret, the plan implemented in turn violated Belgium. A simple assassination involving Serbian nationalism and the Great Hungarian Empire involved Austria into war with Serbia by giving the Serbians an ultimatum that they refused to meet. And this in turn caused the Russians to come to the aid of the Serbians, which brought the Germans into the gig equation because they were afraid of the mobilizing Russian forces of the east with French railroads and the French on the other side. The German plan seeks to knock out France by sweeping through Belgium, before the latter intention of knocking out Russia, inadvertently bringing the BEF, or British Expeditionary Force, into the war. And so a colossal clash of iron-welded armies delivering historically unparalleled firepower without being able to mobilize fast enough to close the deal. And the result was a trench line formed and it was from the sea to the Alps for 4 years of horror and gridlock on the Western Front. The rise of totalitarianism will be ensured coming out of this struggle more, and later a Second World War, even within greater and more horrific results. All right, and for assembly of lectures on World War One, see the Great War channel on YouTube. Of course, an academically accurate channel, and as you know, most YouTube channels are not academic or accurate. Nevertheless, we're now going to talk about the aftermath of the Great War, and that'll probably be it. We'll go ahead and end with that, and then we'll get to major themes and the interwar period of man. Now, the aftermath of the Great War. This was an extraordinary time and should not be lost. The period after the Great War was also extraordinary in that the major events that occurred changed European society. The war itself and the events immediately afterwards should not be seen as independent events. In acknowledging that there was a cumulative effect as one event influences or has a bearing on preceding events. This period of time allows us human beings to assess the costs and benefits of war and peace, as was demonstrated by this period and the aftermath of World War I that followed. What is noticeably apparent was the economic ruin, disabilities, and diseases. When reading about World War I, it can be easy to get lost in all of the statistics, which I must say are extraordinary in their own right. Austria, one part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, for example, 50% of all its agricultural lands were destroyed and unproductive, and in addition to that, many cities in France that were the very industrial centers of that country in Europe were completely annihilated and destroyed. Even places like England, that did not face the magnitude of land battles that France did, would accumulate extremely high losses, the potential of many of its young bright minds. It is staggering to recognize how there was so much starvation and economic ruin as well. But as historians, we need to understand that we are not only looking at and analyzing events of the past, the lives of ordinary people and the very structures of economies and institutions were annihilated. The very economic underpinnings that made these countries the industrial giants of Europe and leaders of the world. Germany lost 90% of its entire merchant shipping force. 10 million killed, 9 million disabled or wounded, and then a 1918 flu pandemic that would kill 50 million humans worldwide. Needless to say, the Great War also led to a tremendous amount of political unrest as well, since it demolished many institutions. And institutions are the bedrock of a successful state. And it led to a lot of political unrest, revolutions, and riots as well, despite times and that were very chaotic. Desperate times bred desperate humans and individuals, even individuals that are so skilled that they can manipulate the desperate in a dark time. In European history, and even in a modern sense, there have always been individuals that thrive in these types of environments and are able to exploit and benefit from it, being at the same time manipulators of it and products of it. For example, in the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, the communists tried to take advantage of weak social structures and the despair that was taking place. We see another example of this in the Greek-Turkish War. For example, the Turks were able, in essence, to change the peace treaties that were put in place and the types of rights and lack of rights that were given. Now, and they did this by force. In war, it is often difficult to impose or legislate the peace, even through treaties. And treaties may be very clear and articulate, but it is different at the national and local level. The Irish War of Independence in 1919 was also a part of the unrest that was occurring as well in Europe. We need to see in hindsight that oftentimes when war ends, it does not mean an immediate ending to all conflict and unrest. Oftentimes the conflicts after a war that take place are largely significant And during and after the Great World War, another phenomena took place: the death and birth of countries. World War I saw the disintegration of major empires: Austria-Hungarian, Russia, Ottoman, etc., as nations then rising out of that ruin, where nationalism becomes more important, as the structures of empire were strained, exhausted, and then destroyed. The very forces that we talked about, military, economic, local, and social, that allowed these empires to thrive, and they were no longer able to inhibit these nationalistic and uprising aspirations. And as a result, we saw the formations of countries such as Austria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Turkey, etc. This was a major phenomenon of the time period. The Treaty of Versailles with Germany in June 28, 1919, was a clear treaty that was created, but it did not immediately create a peace. And so there were major events as a result of the treaty that fed so much of the unrest that took place and would be influential in the onset of World War II. So it was really a intermediate period. Stab in the back. It was common among Germans and German leaders to manipulate the idea that Germany was not defeated in the Great War, even though its allies were certainly defeated and called seas of fire. Germany still had a large army in the field and was not pushed back into the German interior, and there was not major destruction of German cities in its capital. Germany, they declared, was not defeated but betrayed from within by traitors, Jews, and communists. Secondly, the war guilt clause and the Diktat. During the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Germany was forced to sign the Diktat, where we got the words dictator and dictated, agreeing that Germany was the aggressor and the main cause of World War I. She was guilty for the cause of the Great War. Many Germans did not like this, however, hence why they thought that they were forced, in a certain loose sense, into signing the Diktat. And keep in mind that at this time, Germany's interior, that of the Rhineland, was occupied by the Allies at its very industrial centers, and Germany would later default on her reparations. Germany had to pay in her natural resources. Nevertheless, it was seen as monetary because of all the damage that Germany had caused. This was nothing new in warfare. Humans have been doing this since ancient times, but many scholars believe that the reparations were so repressive that it was impossible to pay back. And as a result, the signing of the Diktat was not only humiliating to Germany, but crippling to Germany. By crippling and depressing Germany, it allowed the conditions of misery to give rise to extremists later on, such as that of Adolf Hitler, and thus was counterproductive in creating peace after the Great War. What were the social costs of the Great War? Widespread delusionment, for sure. Ernest Hemingway spoke of this generation as the lost generation. An increase in nihilism, communism, and pacifism. Life has no objective purpose. And so there was definitely a great amount of disillusionment during the times after the Great War. Figures like Neville Chamberlain would embrace the political diplomatic idea of appeasement. When a person is aggressive in diplomacy, the way to prevent war is to appease them and to give them something that they want. In other words, appease the aggressor. Appeasement would be one of the many dangerous ideologies. It was destructive and significantly contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and his aggression. We know from Hitler's private statements that when I am treated, he said, by such the British and other diplomats in the West, this but only encourages my aggression. I have met my enemies, and they are worms. End quote. Internationalism versus nationalism. We have the foundation of the League of Nations in 1919, the notion that individual states, and particularly people within those states, should embrace a wider view in international politics beyond national politics and to peacefully and collectively solve problems. Thus, the very notion of the League of Nations and organizations. And there we go. that is the end of Lecture 2. And see Dr. Colin S. Gray, a book written still in the early 21st century, but it is titled Defining and Achieving Decisive Victory. In our next lecture, Lecture 3, in modern European history, we will discuss major themes during the interwar period between World War I and World War II. And it's just as if they thought that the Great War would be the war to end all wars, the World War. It was the only World War. World War II hadn't happened yet. So there was no World War I. It was the World War. And as we will see, during this time of Reconstruction will only lead to yet another World War. Thank you.